The court is waiting to hear your plea, the judge said. Yes, of course, Your Honor, Buckley said. Now, what are the issues here? The indictment fully states the crime to which the defendant has entered a plea of guilty. The counsel for the defense claims, and would have this court believe, that the mere act of entering a plea of guilty to this indictment should be accepted as evidence mitigating punishment. Speaking for the grief-stricken families of Mary Dalton and Bessie Mears, and for the people of the state of Illinois, thousands of whom are massed out beyond that window waiting for law to take its course, I say that no such quibbling, no such trickery shall pervert this court and cheat the law. A man commits two of the most horrible murders in the history of American civilization. He confesses, and his counsel would have us believe that because he pleads guilty after dodging the law, after attempting to murder the officers of the law, that his plea should be looked upon as evidence mitigating his punishment. I say, Your Honor, that this is an insult to the court and to the intelligent people of the state. If such crimes admit of such defense, if this fiend's life is spared because of such a defense, I shall resign my office and tell those people out there in the streets that I can no longer protect their lives and property. I shall tell them that our courts, swamped with mawkish sentimentality, are no longer fit instruments to safeguard the public peace. I shall tell them that we have abandoned the fight for civilization. After entering such a plea, the counsel for the defense indicates that he shall ask the court to believe that the mental and emotional life of the defendant are such that he does not bear full responsibility for these cowardly rapes and murders. He asks the court to imagine a legendary no man's land of human thought and feeling. He tells us that a man is sane enough to commit a crime, but is not sane enough to be tried for it. Never in my life have I ever heard such sheer legal cynicism, such a cold-blooded and calculated attempt to bedevil and evade the law of my life. I said that this shall not be. The state shall insist that this man be tried by jury. If the defense continues to say that he is insane, if his plea is simply guilty, then the state demands the death penalty for these black crimes. At such time as the court may indicate, I shall offer evidence and put witnesses upon the stand to testify that this defendant is sane and is responsible for these bloody crimes. Your Honor, Max called. You shall have time to plead for your client, Buckley shouted. Let me finish. Do you have an objection, the judge asked, turning to Max. I do, Max said. I hesitate to interrupt the state attorney, but the impression he's trying to make is that I claim that this boy is insane. This is not true. Your Honor, let me state once again that this poor boy, Bigger, enters a plea of guilty. I object, Buckley shouted. I object to the counsel for the defendant speaking of this defendant before the court by any name other than written in the indictment. Such names as Bigger and this poor boy are used to arouse sympathy. Sustained, the judge said. In the future, the defendant shall be designated by the name under which the indictment was drawn. Mr. Max, I think you should allow the state's attorney to continue. There's nothing further I have to say, Your Honor, Buckley said. If it pleases the court, I'm ready to call my witnesses. How many witnesses have you? Max asked. 60, Buckley said. Your Honor, Max said. Bigger Thomas has entered a plea of guilty. It seems that 60 witnesses are not needed. I intend to prove this defendant is sane, that he was and is responsible for these frightful crimes, Buckley said. The court will hear them, the judge said. Your Honor, Max said. Let me clear this thing up. As you know, the time granted me to prepare the defense for Bigger Thomas is pitifully brief, so brief to be without example. This hearing was rushed to the top of the calendar so that this boy might be tried while the temper of the people is white hot. A change of venue is no value now. The same condition of hysteria exists all over the state. These circumstances have placed me in a position of not doing what I think wisest, but of doing what I must. If anybody but a Negro boy were charged with murder, the state's attorney would not have rushed the case to trial and demanded the death penalty. The state has sought to create the impression that I am going to say that this boy is insane. This is not true. I shall put no witnesses upon the stand. I shall witness for Bigger Thomas. I shall present arguments to show that his extreme youth, his mental and emotional life, and the reason why he had pleaded guilty should and must mitigate his punishment. The state's attorney has sought to create the belief that I'm trying to spring some surprise upon this court by having my client enter a plea of guilty. He has sought to foster the notion that some legal trick is involved in this offering of evidence to mitigate the boy's punishment. But we have had many, many cases to come before the courts of Illinois. The Loeb and Leopold case, for example, this is a regular procedure provided for by the enlightened and progressive laws of our state. Shall we deny this boy, because he is poor and black, the same protection, the same chance to be heard and understood that we have so readily granted to others? Your Honor, I am not a coward, but I could not have asked this boy to be freed and given a chance at life while the mob hauls beyond that window. I ask what I must. I ask over the shrill cries of the mob that you spare his life. The law of Illinois regarding a plea of guilty to murder before a court is as follows. The court may impose the death penalty, imprisonment for the defendant for life, or for a term of not less than 14 years. Under this law, the court is able to hear evidence as to the aggravation of mitigation of the offense. The object of this law is to caution the court to find out why a man killed and to allow that to be why the measure of mitigation of. I noticed the state's attorney did not dwell upon why Bigger Thomas killed those two women. There is a mob waiting, he says, so let us kill. His only plea is that if we do not kill, then the mob will kill. He did not discuss the motive for Bigger Thomas's crime because he could not. It is to advantage to act quickly before men have had time to think, before the full facts are known. For he knows that if the full facts were known, if men had time to reflect, he could not stand there and shout for death. What motive actuated Bigger Thomas? There was no motive as motive is understood under our laws today, Your Honor. I shall go deeper into this when I sum up. It is because of the almost instinctive nature of these crimes that I say the mental and emotional life of this boy is important in deciding his punishment. But as the state whets the appetite of the mob by needlessly parading witness after witness before this court, as the state inflames the public mind further with the ghastly details of this boy's crime, I shall listen for the state's attorney to tell this court why Bigger Thomas killed. This boy is young not only in years, but in his attitude toward life. He is not old enough to vote. Living in a black belt district, he is younger than most boys of his age. He has not come in contact with the wide variety and depths of life. He's had but two outlets for his emotion, work and sex, and he knew these their most vicious and degrading forms. I shall ask this court to spare the boy's life, and I have faith enough in the court to believe that it will consent. Max sat down. The courtroom was filled with murmurs. The court will adjourn to 1 hour and reconvene at 1 o'clock, the judge said. Flanked by policemen, Bigger was led back to the crowded hall. Again he passed a window and he saw a sprawling mob held back by troops. He was taken to a room where a tray of food rested on a table. Max was there waiting for him. Come on and sit down, Bigger, eat something. I don't want nothing. Come on, you've got to hold up. I ain't hungry. Here, take a smoke. Nah. You want a drink of water? Nah. Bigger sat in a chair, leaned forward, rested his arm on the table, and buried his face in the crooks of his elbow. He was tired. Now that he was out of the courtroom, he felt the awful strain under which he had been while the men had argued about his life. All the vague thoughts and excitement about finding a way to live and die were far from him now. Fear and dread were the only possible feelings he could have in that courtroom. When the hour was up, when he was led back into court, he rose with the rest when the judge came and then sat down again. The state may call its witnesses, the judge said. Yes, Your Honor, Buckley said. The first witness was an old woman who Bigger had not seen before. During the questioning, he heard Buckley call her Mrs. Ralston. Then he heard the old woman say that she was the mother of Mrs. Dalton. Bigger saw Buckley give her the earring he had seen at the inquest, and the old woman told of how the pair of earrings had been handed down through the years from mother to daughter. When Mrs. Ralston was through, Max said that he had no desire to examine her or any of the state's witnesses. Mrs. Dalton was led to the stand, and she told the same story she had told at the inquest. Mr. Dalton told again why he had hired Bigger and pointed him out as a Negro boy who came to my home to work. Peggy also pointed him out, saying through her sobs, yes, he's the boy. All of them said that he acted like a very quiet and sane boy. Britton told how he suspected that Bigger knew something of the disappearance of Mary and said that black boy is as sane as I am. A newspaper man told of how the smoke in the furnace had caused the discovery of Mary's bones. Bigger heard Max rise when the newspaperman had finished. Your Honor, Max said, I'd like to know how many more newspapermen are to testify. I have 14 more, Buckley said. Your Honor, Max said, this is totally unnecessary. There is a plea of guilty here. I'm going to prove that the killer is sane, Buckley shouted. The court will hear them, the judge said. Proceed, Mr. Buckley. 14 more newspapermen told about the smoke and the bones and said that Bigger acted just like all the other colored boys. At 5 o'clock, the court recessed and a tray of food was placed before Bigger in a small room with 6 policemen standing guard. The nerves of his stomach were so taut that he could only drink the coffee. 6 o'clock found him back in court. The room grew dark and the lights were turned on. The parade of witnesses ceased to be real to Bigger. 5 wet men came to the stand and said that the handwriting on the kidnap note was his, that it was the same writing which they had found on his homework papers taken from the files of the school he used to attend. Another white man said that the fingerprints of Bigger Thomas were found on the door of Miss Dalton's room. Then 6 doctors said Bessie had been raped. 4 colored waitresses from Ernie's kitchen shack pointed him out as the colored boy who was at the table that night with the white man and the white woman, and they said he had acted quiet and sane. Next came 2 white women, school teachers, who said that Bigger was a dull boy but thoroughly sane. One witness melted into another. Bigger ceased to care. He stared listlessly. At times he could hear the faint sound of the winter wind blowing outdoors. He was too tired to be glad when the session ended. Before they took him back to his cell, he asked Max, how long will it last? I don't know, Bigger. You'll have to be brave and hold up. I wish it was over. This is your life, Bigger. You gotta fight. I don't care what they do to me. I wish it was over. The next morning they woke him, fed him, and took him back to court. Jan came to the stand and said what he had said at the inquest. Buckley made no attempt to link Jan with the murder of Mary. G.H. and Gus and Jack told of how they used to steal from stores and newsstands, of the fight they had the morning they planned to rob Blum's. Doc told of how Bigger had cut the cloth on his pool table and said that Bigger was mean and bad, was but sane. 16 policemen pointed out as the man we captured, Bigger Thomas. They said that a man who could elude this law as skillfully as Bigger had sane and responsible. A man whom Bigger recognized as the manager of the Regal Theater told of how Bigger and boys like him masturbated in the theater, and of how he'd been afraid to speak to them about it for fear that they might start a fight and cut him. A man from the juvenile court said that Bigger had served 3 months in a reform school for stealing auto tires. There was a recess, and in the afternoon 5 doctors said that they thought Bigger was sane but sullen and contrary. Bucky brought forth the knife and purse Bigger had hidden in the garbage pail and informed the court that the city's dump had been combed for 4 days to find them. The brick he had used to strike Bessie was shown, then came the flashlight, the communist pamphlet, the gun, the blackened earring, the hatchet blade, the signed confession, the kidnap note, Bessie's bloody clothes, the stained pillows and quilts, the trunk, the empty rum bottle which had been found in the snow near a curb. Mary's bones were brought in, and women in the court began to sob. Then a group of 12 workmen brought in the furnace piece by piece from the Dalton basement and mounted it up against a giant wooden platform. People in the room stood to look, and the judge ordered them to sit down. Buckley had a white girl the size of Mary crawl inside the furnace to prove beyond doubt that it could and did hold the burned and body of ravished innocent Miss Mary Dalton, and to show that the poor girl's head could not go in, and the sadistic Negro cut it off. Using an iron shovel from the Dalton basement, Buckley showed how the bones had been raked out, explained how Bigger had craftily crept up the stairs during the excitement and taken flight. Mopping sweat from his face, Buckley said, "The state rests, Your Honor. Mr. Max," the judge said, "you may proceed to call your witnesses." "The defense does not contest the evidence introduced here," Max said. "I therefore waive the right to call witnesses. As I stated before, at the proper time, I shall present a plea in Bigger Thomas's behalf." The judge informed Buckley that he should sum up. For an hour, Buckley commented upon the testimony of the state's witnesses and interpreted the evidence, concluding with the words, "The intellectual and moral faculties of mankind may as well be declared impotent if the evidence and testimony submitted by the state are not enough to compel this court to impose the death sentence upon Bigger Thomas, this despoiler of women." "Mr. Max, will you be prepared to present your plea tomorrow?" the judge asked. "I will, Your Honor." Back in his cell, Bigger tumbled lifelessly into his cot. Soon it'll be over, he thought. Tomorrow will be the last day. He hoped so. His sense of time was gone. Night and day were now merged. The next morning he was awake in his cell when Max came in. On his way to court, he wondered what Max would say about him. Could Max really save his life? In the act of thinking the thought, he thrust it from him. If he kept hope from his mind, then whatever happened would seem natural. As he was led down the hall, past windows, he saw that the mob and the troops still surrounded the courthouse. The building was still jammed with muttering people. Policemen had to make an aisle for him in the crowd. A pang of fear shot through him when he saw that he had been the first to get to the table. Max was somewhere behind him, lost in the crowd. It was then that he felt more deeply than ever that Max had grown to mean to him. He was defenseless now. What was there to prevent those people from coming across those railings and dragging him into the street now that Max was not here? He sat not daring to look around, conscious that every eye was upon him. Max's presence during the trial had made him feel somewhat in the crowd that stared at him, so that steadily and resentfully something he could cling to, if only he could get at it. There smoldered in him the hope that Max had made him feel in the first long talk they had, but he did not want to risk anything trying to make it flare into flame now, with the trial and the words of hate from Buckley. But neither did he want to stuff it out. He nursed it, he kept it at his last refuge. When Max came, Bigger saw that the face was pale and drawn. There were dark rings beneath the eyes. Max laid a hand on Bigger's knee and whispered, "I'm going to do all I can, son." Court opened and the judge said, "Are you ready to proceed, Mr. Max?" "Yes, Your Honor." Max rose, ran his hand through his white hair, and went to the front of the room. He turned and half-faced the judge and Buckley, looking out over Bigger's head to the crowd. He cleared his throat. "Your Honor, never in my life have I risen in court to make a plea with a firmer conviction in my heart. I know that what I have to say here today touches the destiny of an entire nation. My plea is for more than one man and one people. Perhaps it is in this manner fortunate that the defendant has committed one of the darkest crimes in our memory. For if we can encompass the life of this man and find out what has happened to him, if we can understand how subtly and yet strongly his life and fate are linked to ours, if we can do this, perhaps we shall find the key to our future, that rare vantage point upon which every man and woman in the nation can stand and view how inextricably our hopes and fears of today create the exaltation and doom of tomorrow. Your Honor, I have no desire to be disrespectful to this court, but I must be honest. A man's life is at stake. And not only in this man is a criminal, but he's a black criminal. And as such, he comes into this court under a handicap, notwithstanding our pretensions that all are equal before the law. This man is different, even though his crime differs from similar crimes only in degrees. The complex forces of society have isolated here for us a symbol, a test symbol. The prejudice of men have stained this symbol like a germ stained from examination under the microscope. The unremitting hate of men has given us a psychological distance that will enable us to see tiny social symbol in relation to our whole sick social organism. I say, Your Honor, that the mere act of understanding Bigger Thomas will be thawing out of icebound impulses, a dragging of the sprawling forms of the dread out of the night into the fear of the light and reason, an unveiling of the unconscious ritual of death in which we, like sleepwalkers, have participated so dreamlike and thoughtlessly. But I make no excessive claims, Your Honor. I do not deal in magic. I do not say that if we understand this man's life, we shall solve all our problems, or that when we have all the facts at our disposal, we shall automatically know how to act. Life is not that simple. But I do say if, after I have finished, you feel that death is necessary, then you are making an open choice. What I do want to inject into the consciousness of this court, through the discussion of evidence, the two possible courses of actions open to us and the inevitable consequences flowing from each. And then, if we say death, let us mean it. And if we say life, let us mean that too. But whatever we say, let us know upon what ground we are putting our feet, what the consequences are for us, and whom we judge. Your Honor, I would have you believe that I am not inostensible to the burden of responsibility I am throwing upon your shoulders by the manner in which I have insisted upon conducting the defense of this boy's life, and in my resolve to place before you the entire degree of his guilt for judgment. But under circumstances, what else could I have done? Night after night, I have lain without sleep, trying to think of a way to picture to you and to the world the causes and reasons why this Negro boy sits here, a self-confessed murderer. But every time I thought I had discovered a vital piece of evidence bearing upon his fate, I could hear in my mind's ear the low, angry muttering of that mob, which the state troops are holding at bay beyond the window. How can I asked myself, make my voice heard with effect above the hungry yelping of the hounds on the hunt? How can I asked myself, make the picture of what has happened to this boy show plain and powerful upon a screen of sober reason, when 1,000 newspaper and magazine artists have already drawn it in the lurid ink upon 1,000,000 sheets of public print? Dare I, deeply mindful of this boy's background and race, put his fate in the hands of the jury, not of his peers, but of an alien and hostile race, whose minds are already conditioned by the press of the nation, a press which has already reached a decision as to guilt and in countless editorials suggested the measure of his punishment? No, I could not. It would not be better if we had no courts of law than that justice should be administered under such conditions. An outright lynching would be more honest than a mock trial. Rather that courts be abolished and each man buy arms and proceed to protect himself or make war for what he thinks is rightfully his own, than that a man should be tried by men who have already made up their minds that he is guilty. I could not have placed at the disposal of the jury the evidence, so general and yet so confoundingly specific, so impalpable and yet so disastrous in its terrible consequences would have affected my client and account for his being here today before the bar of judgment with his life at stake. I could not have done that and been honest with myself or with this boy. So today I come to face this court, rejecting a trial by jury, willingly entering a plea of guilty, asking in the light of the laws of the state that the boy be spared for reasons which I believe affect the foundations of our civilization. The most habitual thing for the court to do is to take the line of least resistance and follow the suggestion of the state's attorney and say death, and that would be the end of this case. But that would not be the end of the crime. This is why the court must do otherwise. There are times, Your Honor, when reality bears features of such an impellingly moral complexion that it is impossible to follow the hewn path of expediency. There are times when the life ends are so raveled that reason and sense cry out, and then we stop and gather them together again before we can proceed. The atmosphere surrounds this trial. Are the citizens soberly intent upon seeing the law is executed, that retribution is dealt out in measures with the offense, that the guilty and only the guilty is caught and punished? No, every conceivable prejudice has been dragged into this case. The authorities of the city and state deliberately inflame the public mind to the point where they could not keep peace without martial law. Responsible to nothing but their own corrupt conscience, the newspapers and prosecution launched the ridiculous claim that the Communist Party was in some way linked to these two murders. Only here in court yesterday morning did the state's attorney cease implying that Bigger Thomas was guilty of other crimes, crimes which he could not prove. And because I, a Jew, dared defend this Negro boy, for days my mail has been flooded with threats against my life. The manner in which Bigger Thomas was captured, the hundreds of innocent Negro homes invaded, the scores of Negroes assaulted upon the streets, the dozens who were thrown out of their jobs, the barrage of lies poured out from every source against a defenseless people, all this was something unheard of in democratic lands. The hunt for Bigger Thomas served as an excuse to terrorize the entire Negro population, to arrest hundreds of communists, to raid labor unions' headquarters and workers' organizations. Indeed, the tone of the press, the silence of the church, the attitude of the prosecution, and the stimulated temper of the people are of such a nature as to indicate that more than revenge is being sought upon a man who committed a crime. What is the cause of all this high feeling and excitement? Is it the crime of Bigger Thomas? Were Negroes liked yesterday and hated today because of what he has done? Were labor unions and workers' halls raided solely because a Negro committed a crime? Did those white bones lying on the table evoke the gasp of horror that went up from the nation? Did the feeling against a Jew in the city rise only because a Jewish lawyer is defending a black boy? Your Honor, you know this is not the case. All these factors in the present hysteria existed before Bigger Thomas was ever heard of. Negroes, workers, and labor unions were hated as much as yesterday as they are today. Crimes of even greater brutality and horror have been committed in this city. Gangsters have killed and have gone free to kill again, but none of that brought forth an indignation equal to this. Your Honor, that mob did not come here of its own accord. It was incited. Until a week ago, those people lived their lives as quietly as always. Who then fanned this latent hate into fury? Whose interest is that thoughtless and misguided mob serving? Why did every agency of communication in the city suddenly spew forth lies, telling our citizens that they had to protect what they owned against Bigger Thomas and men like him? Who provoked this hysteria so that they might profit by it? The state's attorney knows, for he promised the loot bankers that if he were reelected, demonstrations for relief would be stopped. The governor of the state knows, for he has pledged the Manufacturers Association that he would use troops against the workers who went out on strike. The mayor knows, for he told the merchants of the city that the budget would be cut down, that no new taxes would be imposed to satisfy the clamor of the masses of the needy. There is a guilt and the rage that demands that this man's life be snuffed out quickly. There is fear in the hate and impatience which impels the action of the mob congregated upon the streets beyond the window. Each of them, the mob and the mob masters, the wire pullers and the frightened, the leaders and their pet vassals, know and feel that their lives are built upon a historical deed of wrong against many people, people from whom these lives have bled their leisure and their luxury. Their feelings of guilt is as deep as the boy who sits here on trial today. Fear and hate and guilt are the keynotes of this drama. Your Honor, for the sake of this boy and myself, I wish I could bring to this court evidence of a morally worthier nature. I wish I could say that love, ambition, jealousy, the quest for adventure, or any of the more romantic feelings were back of these two murders. If I could honestly invest the hapless actor in this fateful drama with feeling of a loftier cast, my task would be easier and I would feel confident of the outcome. The odds would be with me, for I would be appealing to men bound by common ideals to judge with pity and understanding one of their brothers who erred and fell in the struggle. But I have no choice in this matter. Life has cut the cloth, not I. We must deal here with the raw stuff of life, emotion and impulses and attitudes, as yet conditioned by the strivings of science and civilization. We must deal here with the first wrong which, when committed by us, was understandable and inevitable. And then we must deal with the long, trailing black sense of guilt stemming from that wrong, a sense of guilt which self-interest and fear would not let us atone. We must deal here with the hot blast of hate engendered in others by that first wrong, and that monstrous and horrible crimes flowing from the hate, a hate which has seeped down into the hearts and molded the deepest and most delicate sensibilities of multitudes. We must deal here with the dislocation of life involving millions of people, a dislocation so vast as to stagger the imagination, so fraught with tragic consequences as to make us rather not want to look at it or think of it, so old that we would rather try to view it as an order of nature and strive with uneasy conscience and false moral fervor to keep it so. But we must deal here on both sides of the fence, among whites as well as blacks, among workers as well as employers, with men and women in whose minds were loomed good and bad of such height and weight that they assume proportions of abnormal aspect and construction. When situations like this arise, instead of men feeling that they are facing other men, they feel they are facing mountains, floods, seas, forces of nature whose size and strength focus the minds and emotions to a degree of tension unusual in the quiet routine of urban life. Yet this tension exists within the limits of urban life, undermining it and supporting it in the same gesture of being. Allow me, Your Honor, before I proceed to cast blame and ask for mercy, state emphatically that I do not claim that this boy is a victim of injustice, nor do I ask this court be sympathetic with them. That is not my object in embracing this character and this cause. That is not my object in embracing his character and his cause. It is not to tell you only of the suffering that I stand here today, even though there are frequent lynchings of floggings of Negroes throughout the country. If you react only to part of what I say, then you too are caught as much in the mire of blood, of blind emotion, and in this vicious game will roll on like a bloody river to a bloodier sea. Let us banish from our minds the thought that this is an unfortunate victim of injustice. The very concept of injustice rests upon a premise of equal claims, and this boy here today makes no claim upon you. If you think or feel that he does, then you too are blinded by the feelings as terrible as that which you condemn in him, and without as much justification. The feeling of guilt which has caused all the mob fear and the mob hysteria is the counterpoint of his own hate. Rather, I plead with you to see the mode of life in a midst, a mode of life stunted and distorted, but possessing its own laws and claims, an existence of men growing out of the soil prepared by the collective but blind will of 100 million people. I beg you to recognize human life draped in a form and guise alien to ours, but springing from a soil plowed and sown by all of our hands. I ask you to recognize the laws and processes flowing from such a condition, understand them, seek to change them. If we do none of these, then we should not pretend horror or surprise when thwarted life expresses itself in fear and hate and crime. This is life, new and strange. Strange because we fear it, new because we have kept our eyes turned from it. This is life lived in cramped limits and expressing itself not in terms of our good and bad, but in terms of its own fulfillment. Men are men, and life is life, and we must deal with them as they are. And if we want to change them, we must deal with them in the form in which they exist and have their being. Your Honor, I must still speak in general terms, for the background of this boy must be shown, a background which has acted powerfully and importantly upon his conduct. Our forefathers came to these shores and faced a harsh and wild country. They came here with a stifled dream in their hearts, from lands where their personalities had been denied, as even we have denied the personality of this boy. They came from the cities of the old world where the means to sustain life were hard to get or own. They were colonists and they were faced with a difficult choice. They had either to subdue this wild land or be subdued by it. We need but turn our eyes upon the imposing sweep of streets and factories and buildings to see how completely they have conquered. But in conquering they used others, used their lives. Like a miner using a pick or a carpenter using a saw, they bent the will of others to their own. Lives to them were tools and weapons to be wielded against a hostile land and climate. I do not say this in terms of moral condemnation. I do say it to rouse pity in you for the black men who were slaves for 2 1/2 centuries. It would be foolish now to look back upon that in the light of injustice. Let us not be naive. Men do what they must, even when they feel they are being driven by God, even when they feel they are fulfilling the will of God. Those men were engaged in a struggle for life, and their choice in the matter was small indeed. It was in the imperial dream of feudal age that made men enslave others. Exalted by the will to rule, they could not have built nations on so vast a scale had they not shut their eyes to the humanity of other men, men whose lives were necessary for their building. But the invention and widespread use of machines made the further direct enslavement of men economically impossible, and so slavery ended. Let me, Your Honor, dwell a moment longer upon the danger of looking upon this boy in the light of injustice. If I should say that he is a victim of injustice, then I would be asking to implication for sympathy. And if one insists upon looking at the boy as a victim of injustice, he will be swamped by a feeling of guilt so strong as to be indistinguishable from hate. Of all things, men do not like to feel that they are guilty of wrong, and if you make them feel guilt, they will try desperately to justify it on any grounds. But, failing that, and seeing no immediate solution that will set things right without too much cost to their lives and property, they will kill that which evoked in them the condemning sense of guilt. And this is true of all men, whether they be white or black. It is a peculiar and powerful but common need. Your Honor, let me give you an example. When this poor black boy, Bigger Thomas, was trying to cast the blame for his crime upon one of the witnesses, Janner Lone, a communist, who faced his court yesterday, and this boy thought he would be able to blame his crime upon the communists with impunity because the newspapers had convinced him that communists were criminals. An example of such fear guilt occurred. Janner Lone confronted Bigger Thomas upon a street corner and sought to have it out with him, demanding to know why Bigger was trying to blame the crime upon him. Janner Lone told me that Bigger Thomas acted as hysterically as those people are acting at this moment in the mob outdoors. Bigger Thomas drew a gun and commanded Janner Lone to leave him. Bigger Thomas was almost a stranger to Janner Lone, and Janner Lone was almost a stranger to him, yet they hated each other. Today, Bigger Thomas and that mob are strangers, yet they hate. They hate because they fear, and they fear because they feel that the deepest feelings of their lives are being assaulted and outraged, and they do not know why. They were powerless pawns in a blind play of social forces. This guilt fear is the basic tone of the prosecution and of people in the case. In their hearts, they feel that a wrong has been done, and when a Negro commits a crime against them, they fancy they see the ghastly evidence of that wrong. So the men of wealth and property, the victims of attack who are eager to protect their profits, say that their guilty hirelings stamp out this ghost. Or like Mr. Dalton, they say, let's do something for this man so he won't feel that way. But then it is too late. Do I say this to make you believe that this boy is blameless? No, Bigger Thomas's own feelings of hate feeds the feeling of guilt in others. Hemmed in, limited, circumscribed, he sees and feels no way of acting except to hate and kill that which he thinks is crushing him. Your Honor, I'm trying to wipe out the circle of blood, trying to cut down into this matter beneath hate and fear and guilt and revenge and show what impulses are twisted. If only 20 or 10 Negroes had been put into slavery, we could call it injustice. But there were hundreds of thousands of them throughout the country. If the state of affairs had lasted for 2 or 3 years, we could say it was unjust, but it lasted for more than 200 years. Injustice which lasts for 3 long centuries and which exists among millions of people over thousands of square miles of territory is injustice no longer. It is an accomplished fact of life. Men adjust themselves to their land. They create their own laws of being, their notions of right and wrong. A common way of earning a living gives them common attitude toward life. Even their speech is colored and shaped by what they must undergo. Your Honor, injustice blots out one form of life, but another grows up in its place with its own rights, needs, and aspirations. What is happening here today is not injustice, but oppression, an attempt to throttle or stamp out a new form of life. And it is in this new form of life that has grown up here in our midst that puzzles us, that expresses itself, like a weed growing from under a stone, in terms we call crime. Unless we grasp this problem in the light of the new reality, we cannot do more than salve our feelings of guilt and rage with more murder when a man, living under such conditions, commits an act which we call a crime. This boy represents but a tiny aspect of a problem whose reality sprawls over a third of this nation. Kill him. Burn the life out of him. And still, when the delicate and unconscious machinery of race reaction slips, there will be murder again. How can law contradict the lives of millions of people and hope to be administered successfully? Do we believe in magic? Do you believe that by burning a cross you can frighten a multitude, paralyze their will and impulses? Do you think that the white daughters in the homes of America will be any safer if you kill this boy? No. I tell you in all solemnity that they won't. The surest way to make certain that there will be no more such murders is to kill this boy. And your rage and guilt make thousands of other black men and women feel that barriers are tighter and higher. Kill him and swell the tide of pent-up lava that will someday break loose, not in a single blundering accidental individual crime, but in a wild cataract of emotion that will brook no control. The all-important thing for this court to remember in deciding this boy's fate is that, though the crime was accidental, the emotions that broke loose were already there. The thing to remember is that this boy's way of life was a way of guilt, that his crime existed long before the murder of Mary Dalton, that the accidental nature of his crime took the guise of a sudden and violent rent in the veil behind which he lived, a rent which allowed his feelings of resentment and estrangement to leap forth and find objective and concrete form. Obsessed with guilt, we have sought to thrust a corpse from before our eyes. We have marked off a little plot of ground and buried it. We tell our souls in the deep of the black night that it is dead and that we have no reason for fear or uneasiness. But the corpse returns and raids our homes. We find our daughters murdered and burnt, and we say, kill, kill. But, Your Honor, I say stop. Let us look at this which we are doing. For the corpse is not dead. It still lives. It has made itself a home in the wild forest of our great cities, amid the rank and choking vegetation of slums. It has forgotten our language. In order to live, it has sharpened its claws. It has grown hard and calloused. It has developed a capacity for hate and fury which we cannot understand. Its movements are unpredictable. By night it creeps from its lair and steals toward the settlement of civilization. And at that sight its kind face it does not lie down upon its back and kick up its heels playfully to be tickled and stroked. No, it leaps to kill. Yes, Mary Dalton, a well-intentioned white girl with a smile upon her face, came to Bigger Thomas to help him. Mr. Dalton, feeling vaguely that a social wrong existed, wanted to give him a job so that his family could eat and his sister and brother could go to school. Mrs. Dalton, trying to grope her way towards a sense of decency, wanted him to go to school and learn a trade. But when they stretched forth their helping hands, death struck. Today they mourn and wait for revenge. The wheel of blood continues to turn.